Bien, nous allons donc reprendre nos travaux et nous sommes très heureux d'entendre Michał Kozłowski, qui est professeur à l'université de Varsovie, philosophe, sociologue, journaliste. Vous éditez notamment le magazine Bez Dogmatu, mais aussi la version polonaise du Monde diplomatique. Vous avez notamment publié The Art Factory en 2013 et coédité différents volumes en français. On peut notamment lire de vous dans la revue en ligne Variations, les contre-pouvoirs de Foucault, paru en 2011. Et c'est sur les rapports entre la Pologne et Michel Foucault, Mutual Reading, que nous allons vous écoutez.
Ça, avec ce micro, ça m'a fait penser à Che Guevara à Moscou. Il y avait mais qui se battait contre. Alors, tout d'abord, je tiens à remercier Didier Fassin pour cette magnifique opportunité de vous rejoindre justement pour fêter, pour célébrer l'anniversaire de la naissance de Foucault, pas comme la plupart qui ont célébré sa mort, donc quelque sorte. Ok, je passe à l'anglais. This will be a let's hope pretty concise paper divided in two parts. Since Foucault is a French philosopher, not German, doesn't need to be divided in three parts, right? You know, I mean, so the first part is how, because the whole thing, as you see, it's a mutual reading, so almost mutual understanding, but not quite. So the first part will be how Foucault misunderstood us. And the second one will be how we misunderstood Foucault. So this is this kind of negative dialectics. So Foucault arrived in Poland in October 1958 and left in the summer of 1959, cutting short his planned 4-year tenure at the newly established Centre de civilisation française at the University of Warsaw. His departure came at the direct request of the Polish Foreign Ministry. The decision maker and the exact reasons remain unknown. What we do know is the context. The homosexual circles of late 50s Warsaw and Jurek. We never identified Jurek. We only know out of testimonies that he was a student of working class origin, and also he was an informant of Służba Bezpieczeństwa, of the secret police. But in fact, this context explains little. Unlike in the Soviet Union or both Germanies or England, homosexuality was not criminalized in Poland at the time. Even, of course, it was still being exploited by secret services for their purposes. But it couldn't have been the reason of Foucault being expelled. Also, after 1956 de-Stalinization, which, as some of you remember, was absolutely major event in Eastern Europe, the ideological landscape changed dramatically. While the Communist Party managed to maintain its grip on political power, it largely withdrew from ideological monopoly, which you could even describe in terms of new social contract, very weird social contract. They liberated culture, humanities, and social sciences, unless you were not directly opposing their politics, not directly opposing the government, which in those circumstances produced quite an amazing, but I'll come back to it a little later, cultural explosion of cultural intellectual production. But there is something more that is really awkward in this story. I let speak now a historian who spent over 2 years in Polish archive looking for traces of Michel Foucault from these years, 1958, 1959. The Institute of National Remembrance, IPN, was the first place I turned into my search for traces of Foucault in Poland. This thing is a very strange thing. It's, some former dictatorships have it. Basically, this is the institute that is supposed to do research, investigation, and even criminal prosecution against communist crimes. It's a pseudo-scientific institution, but they hold by law all the archives of secret police and some other archives. So I wasn't the first to approach IPN with this request. Many had already tried to find information about Foucault, including me, in fact, years ago. It was obvious that the first director of the French Cultural Center in communist-era Warsaw would have been under surveillance. The files must have existed. Yet, the IPN's response is, in response to your request for access to the documents for the purpose of scientific research, skip, I kindly inform you that the inquiry regarding Michel Foucault, born October 15, 1926, conducted for your request, yielded a negative result. The Warsaw branch office of access and archiving documents of the IPN has completed the processing of your request. So there was nothing in the archives of communist police. Everywhere I turned, I received the same answer. The archives of the University of Warsaw contained no information about Michel Foucault's stay in the Faculty of Philology between 59 and 58. Searches at Jagiellonian University and the University of Gdańsk, where, according to biographical records, Foucault had given lectures, also came up empty. The Polish Academy of Sciences had nothing. A review of the files from the Warsaw Faculty of Philology and Institute of Romance Studies, where he also lectured, yielded nothing. The French Cultural Center had no archives of Foucault. The French institutes in Warsaw and Krakow knew only that Foucault had indeed been in Poland. The French embassy provided general information about Polish-French cooperation from this period, but there was no single mention of Foucault. There are no archive for the Orbis company, the monopoly of foreign tourism and agency kind of thing. There were no records from the Bristol hotel where he reportedly stayed for a while. Also, Warsaw Okęcie Airport archives held no data of any possible flights by Foucault. Museums, cultural institutions, Polish press agency, journals of Życie Warszawy, Przekrój, the archives of the Palace of Culture and Science, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum, the Tworki Psychiatric Hospital, all had zero information. There were no witnesses to his stay, no material at all. No memories, no letters, no documents, not even a single photograph. Michel Foucault's time in Poland seemed to be nothing more than a legend. So it is really an amazing thing. It was Michel Foucault, after all, who taught us so much about the power of archives, exams, records, personal records, fixing identities through records, transforming subject, and constituting various fields of knowledge about the social. Yet, visibly, he somehow managed to escape the omnipresent gaze of such noble institutions as universities, libraries, and last but not least, secret police. But had the documents been deliberately destroyed, the mystery would be even greater. Such an operation would have required a coordinated effort by many, which would imply there was a serious and clear motive one cannot possibly identify. In any case, it is certain that Foucault himself had nothing to do with the mysterious disappearance of his files. Yet he somehow miraculously managed not to be pinned down, to hide his face, as he exclaims in the famous passage from the Archaeology of Knowledge, No, 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 I'm not where you are lying in wait for me, but over here laughing at you. Yet Foucault's premature, almost violent departure also veiled from him most of what was happening in Poland at the time. In fact, in the very quarter where he lived and had his office, in the years between 1956 and 1968, well, they were marked by what I call Polish cultural revolution, a straightforward opposite of the upcoming Chinese cultural revolution, because it was a revolution of high culture, arts, and humanities. Some of you will know that because parts of this cultural production found its way, in particular to France, in the 1960s. Yeah? So there was a Polish school of cinema with Wajda, Haas, and Polański. The Polish school of poster with Roman Cieślewicz, who also moved to France afterwards, and Jan Lenica. The theater of Tadeusz Kantor and Jerzy Grotowski. The poetry of Wisława Szymborska and Tadeusz Różewicz. The historical school of Kula and Małowist, Warsaw structuralism in literary studies, and perhaps most importantly, from my perspective, because this is my tradition and my mentors and the mentors of my mentors, a vibrant Marxism revisionism. So people like Leszek Kołakowski, Bronisław Baczko, Zygmunt Bauman, or Krzysztof Pomian were boldly stepping out of Marxist orthodoxy just at the end of the 50s. Their answer to what they perceived as democratic deficit and emancipatory deadlock of real socialism was the project of rethinking the central ideas of Western modernity in their very historicity. Foucault met some of this crowd, as well as some older renowned Polish intellectuals like Tadeusz Kotarbiński or Jerzy Zawiejski. Yet we find no evident trace of theoretical exchange. Yet something must have happened. And this is something I discovered as my half-amateur historian work. In 1966, so some 7 years after he was expelled, every member of the Department of History of Modern Philosophy, which is my center, well, the Center of History of Modern Philosophy at the University of Warsaw, which was at the time the temple of revisionists, received, and everybody, there were 6, everybody at their personal address, so they received it at home, a copy of Les Mots et les Choses. And again, nobody remembered who, well, if there was any institution other than the editor, but we can almost be sure that Foucault must have been behind it. Otherwise, why would they send 6 copies to Poland at personal addresses? By the way, we have to remember, which we forgot, or tend to forget, at the time it was easy to get personal addresses of people. Even in some central post offices in Paris, you could get Warsaw's yellow pages and simply look by name. So it was not at all impossible to do it. Yeah? So at the beginning of the following year, a session of Bronisław Baczko's seminar was held on the subject of Les Mots et les Choses. And Baczko and Krzysztof Pomian both introduced the reading. The seminar was long, and the book definitely attracted big interests. Yet the conclusions were skeptical. Well, the interlocutors recognized that here the dialectics is replaced by rupture, and they admitted there are some strong arguments in favor of that, yet they saw no clear new framework for political action that Foucault's work would carry. Yeah, but a year later, and 9 years after Foucault's deportation, most members of the seminar were forced into emigration following the nationalist and anti-Semitic takeover attempt within the Communist Party, and also this 1968 marks the end of this golden age of Polish culture between 1956 and 1968, precisely. Well, not at all, yeah, but yes, in a sense, I think you can risk such an assertion. But interestingly, while Foucault's international odyssey started in Poland. It is also his last foreign engagement that is connected to Poland. In 1982, he co-authored with Pierre Bourdieu and others a condemnation of the French government's neutrality towards a Jaruzelski coup against Solidarność. He also sketched a couple of short texts which largely recount the themes raised by the political émigrés from the Solidarność coordinating committee in Paris at the time. And later that year, which is already a bit above the average engagement, I would say, he took a lorry with humanitarian aid to Warsaw, and they stayed for 2 nights in the Victoria Hotel in the center of Warsaw, just 300 meters from the office he had in 1958-59. Yeah? Foucault doesn't very often refer to Poland in his interview, but he's pretty coherent of how he sees Poland. I'll give you a quote from an interview from 1978. I finished writing that book, L'Histoire de la Folie, in Poland, and I could not fail to think as I was writing of what I could see around me. Yet although by a sort of analogical, non-genealogical relation, I grasped a kinship, a resemblance. I couldn't see exactly how the mechanism of confinement and general disciplinarization of society function. In other words, I couldn't see how my research into the history of madness and what I sensed around me could be integrated into an overall analysis stretching from the formation of the capitalist societies in Europe in the 17th century to the socialist societies of the 20th century, says Foucault. So Poland, in a certain way, for him, was still the experience of really existing confinement. So now a few words. I mean, how am I with time? Is it okay? Yeah, it's okay, right. So now how we misunderstood Foucault. One of the paradoxes of Michel Foucault's work, as we know, and also quite possibly important part of an explanation of Foucault's enormous success, is that unlike many of his peers from the Golden Friend generation, his writing is accessible, his arguments clear, his style seductive, and yet, at the same time, it is always hard to determine where he stands, or at least for what he stands. At the same time, we are all convinced that his joyful positivism is no less than a spiritual project, right? Well, you know, to what extent this presence of Foucault today is I checked it 2 years ago, but Foucault on Google Scholar, I hate visiting Google Scholar, but he has accumulated 1,417 citations and almost 400,000 of them after 2020. So in today's humanities, Foucault is everywhere, to paraphrase his own expression. Foucault is everywhere, not because he embraces everything, but because he comes from everywhere. I mean, Foucault said it about power, as you remember. Yeah? Foucault taught us a great deal about malicious and arbitrary power of classification to which we are all subjected today, and particularly in social sciences, and at the same time, he stands at the forefront of all classifications. That's how he cooked us, Foucault, yes. Yeah, but so let's come back to Poland then. In this sense, in Poland, like in the most countries of the world, we faced a challenge how to take Foucaultian concepts and invest them with local history, local forms of power, local orders of discourse. It took some time to situate Foucault in this context, and this trajectory was pretty strange because the first book of Foucault that appeared in Polish in 1977 was the archaeology of knowledge. So the most hermetic, probably, of all his books, as methodological or almost methodological books often are. And it was translated, or at least prefaced, it was at the initiative of Jerzy Topolski, an important historian, who saw Foucault as a kind of heretical offshoot of the Annales school. Really, that's what... so it was already pretty far away. And then L'Histoire de la Folie appeared only 10 years later, at the very dawn of real socialism, and Discipline and Punished was published in 1993 during the grim apogee of, well, transition to capitalism and economic collapse that was connected with this transition. And then the reading was, interestingly or not, most of the readers and commentators assumed that Foucault described our past, not our present. In other words, that he described that panopticon and discipline are extremely well-fitting a description of communist regimes. Then some decried the fainting subject, while the majority of intellectual crowd desperately wanted the subject back and were looking at Habermas, for instance. Yeah, I mean, yeah. But by the way, when we knew Frankfurt School, so when Surveiller et Punir first appeared, it was well what my professors were saying. Yeah, well, we've read Adorno already. Yeah, I mean, like it's not a. It took us some time to decipher. It's essentially different. But then, of course, the temptation of understanding communism through Foucault was a big misunderstanding. This was a shallow analogy rather than anything else. And why? Well, because the communist institutions over time were increasingly unproductive. Historians agree that the major reason for communism collapse was its incapacity, precisely its incapacity of imposing work discipline. The task that liberal capitalist societies seemed to successfully have solved. Communist biopolitics was being hesitant and crippled, and secret service was increasingly self-serving rather than all-knowing. It was only much later, I would say around 2010, when we started realizing that Foucault had much more to offer in understanding of our present than our past. The rapid and deep transformation of Polish society, its organic integration to global capitalistic market, introduction of the new forms of governance, management, control, safety and security, measurements and classifications. The new fields of power knowledge and the new modes of production of knowledge. All those changes were both immensely productive and efficient, in stark contrast with simulacra-like institutions of ancien régime, in the sense, real socialism, right? And unlike them, these transformations didn't come from any form of sovereign vertical power. They were always appearing as coming from nowhere, dispersed, arranged in networks, settled by various decentralized bureaucracies. So Polish transition into neoliberalism has in fact little to do with caricature we often give of neoliberalism in France. So it's not market and only market. No. It was much more Foucaultian at the image of naissance de la biopolitique. Of course, less perhaps Surveiller et Punir. It was the government for the sake of competition, by the means of competition. But this was, as far as possible, from the mythology of ultra-liberalism. It required intervention and planification. It costed a lot of public money and had no aversion to public institutions of a new type. And also, Poland was at the time recipient of probably the biggest single packet of development aid in world history, amounting to some 200 billion euros net. And I dare say it was in a big part designed by, of course, European Commission, which from this point of view fits, I think, Foucaultian descriptions of efficient political or governmental action. So this model also was rather tremendously successful according to its own measures and sometimes according to external measures even. I mean, all the indicators from PPP, productivity, competitivity, as well as the biopolitical order like life expectancy, mortality at birth, educational achievement, and even incarceration, all those measures, all those indicators radically improved. In any case, roughly at the same time when Polish social scientists, both critical and less critical, started to realize that there is something essentially Foucaultian going on, another change took place. The change consisting of the rise and rise and rise of authoritarian populism. And of course, some still try to interpret this new political form as a direct rejection of this Foucaultian splendid machinery of neoliberalism. But I don't think it is a quite adequate description. I will getting to an end, I'll let myself a little hypothesis that may be arrogant, but I have an impression that what we are facing now, this phenomenon that we have a hard time to name even, some call it illiberalism, some call it authoritarian populism, some talk about return of fascism. Can this reality still be grasped by Foucaultian concepts? As I will quote Foucault, if we consider then the important points of Foucault's method, is, as he said, I cite Foucault, are, as he says, the real political task in society such as ours is to criticize the workings of institutions that appear to be both neutral and independent, to criticize and attack them in such a manner that the political violence that has always exercised itself obscurely through them will be unmasked, so that we can fight against them. Or another commandment, power is tolerable only on the condition that it masks a substantial part of itself. Its success is proportional to its ability to hide its own mechanisms. And third, this is very important, there is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. And in the end, a famous quote, the strategic adversary is fascism. The fascism in us all, in our heads and in our everyday behavior, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us. Well, the question is, are the new forms of power emerging? Those vertical, sovereign, shameless, exhibitionist, that, as my distinguished colleagues already said, are not at all preoccupied with power, with connection between knowledge and power. That basically don't like scientists. They can still, we often believe that, well, no, our colleagues, some of them, no, they start understanding that only humanities are a threat. Right? Because they will always need hard sciences. No, they won't. They will need the best engineers. Because knowledge is always, in this perspective, knowledge is always suspicious. Any entry into the field of knowledge is already, I would say, not needed from this perspective. And I don't mean by that that Foucault will disappear. I will, of course not. But I think there may be something happening like Weberization of Foucault. Of course, no government in our later or too late modernity will completely give up the government through discipline. So Foucaultian categories will still be applicable as Weberian are. The thing is, Foucault, there was this scandalous as always text of Jean Baudrillard from late 70s, Oubliez Foucault, I don't know if you remember, and he used this perverted argument that Foucault is wrong because he's right, because the description of power Foucault gives is so adequate, so fitting, that it can no longer be critical. That was the argument. And it was like that. Foucault is a child of progressive epoch, and his critique is aimed at kind of progressive forms of power. Mostly, not always, but mostly. And I don't think we can move with him further away, or we'll have to transform him somehow. Thank you.